And then the church fathers. The early church fathers are always quoting the New Testament. The early church fathers quote the New Testament. Now, by the way, when an early church father is quoting it, is it possible he's misquoting it or he missed a word or something, or he's paraphrasing it? And oftentimes I do this. You paraphrase the Bible and you're not quoting it word for word, you're just giving a summary of what it said. But oftentimes they will quote it word for word. And so the scholars will go through and pull out those quotes from the early church father and say, how is this similar and how is this dissimilar to what we have in our uncial manuscripts, in our papyri manuscripts, and in our minuscule manuscripts? How do the church fathers agree or disagree with that? So there's thousands of those quotes that are sifted through. And then there's lectionary readings. Now you all know what lectionary readings are. In the back of your hymn book in most churches, we go down to Park Street Church in Boston with Dr. Gordon Hugenberger, and in the back of the hymnal, there'll be these scriptural readings, and these scriptural readings are called lectionaries. They're special readings that are compiled for the church and to be read at different seasons, at Easter, Christmas, or whatever. And so there'll be different readings on, prayer of repentance or, comfort or whatever. And they'll pull out several scripture passages from different places and put them together. So those lectionary readings, we've got early church lectionaries that we can compare and say, how are these similar or dissimilar to what we have in our early manuscripts? Our early manuscripts being the minuscules, the uncials, and the papyrus. Now, I want to compare the New Testament to something like Plato. Plato, the student of Socrates, we've got about 7 manuscripts on Plato from about 900 A.D. 900 A.D., about 7 manuscripts. You see the difference between that and 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament going back to 125 within 30 years of when John lived. Plato lived back 400s BC? 400s BC. And our best manuscripts are coming from 900 AD. Now this data may be old. My guess is they found new manuscripts of Plato as they found new manuscripts of the Bible. But this coming out of just a few years ago, this is what we had, about a handful of manuscripts. The same thing with Aristotle. Aristotle, we've got basically 5 manuscripts. They date from 1100 AD. Where is Aristotle? Aristotle taught Alexander. Alexander's 333 BC, so we're talking, 340, thereabouts, BC, so that's 300 years before Christ. Our earliest and best manuscripts are 1100 AD. There's only about 5 or 6 of them. There's a handful of them. So I'm saying is that it's very different than the Greek New Testament where there's 5,000 Greek manuscripts, and some of them going back to within 50, 100 years of the time that they were written. So all I'm saying is that our manuscript evidence for the New Testament is very substantial, and it is very early, and there is no other document, there is no other ancient document that can hold a candle to it. It's absolutely incredible. So we should be very proud and very confident in the Word of God that we've got. Now, when these manuscripts come, let's look at the Greek manuscripts. These editors that put the manuscripts together, that pull all these thousands of manuscripts together that the scribes copied, they'll group them into families. Now, what's a family? You have a parent manuscript, and a parent manuscript is copied by 1 scribe, 2 scribes, 3 scribes, 4 scribes. But you see that all of these 4 scribes will all go back to that parent. So you have like a parent and you have a child. You have a parent and then it's copied 5 times, and so you have 5 children. So those 5 children, if there's an error, suppose this guy copied it wrong, the original guy copied it wrong. He spelled their T-H-E-I-R, he spelled it wrong, flipped the letters. Then these guys here, in their 5, may also have that same error that the parent transmits down to the child. And then this child will, and so they group them into families, okay? And so this is the best family. This is the family of uncials, considered the Alexandrian family. And there's 3 big manuscripts. These are the 3 big ones that much of the New Testament and Old Testament, for that matter, is based on. Codex Vaticanus, it's given the letter B, Vaticanus, and it comes from about the 4th century, about 300 AD. This is going to be a big codex. Codex is a book. Books, by the way, do you realize before about 100 AD, before that we have scrolls. Okay, things were written on scrolls. And then about 100 AD and following, that's when we get bound books, okay? What's the difference between a scroll and a book? Well, if you want to access something in a scroll, you've got to scroll through it. You got this big long scroll that you have to, turn and go like that. When you have a book, you have like almost instant access. You can jump into a book, it's bound, and you can jump into a place, and so it allows for easier access. But the book, the codex as it's called, the book was coming into vogue about 100 AD. It was a shift from scrolls to books, right about the time of the end of the first century, thereabouts. And, there's slop on both sides where it goes. Codex Sinaiticus comes from, again, 300s, 400s AD. They have trouble dating these things exactly. And then Codex Alexandrinus is the letter A, and that'll be a 5th century in the 400s. And so these are three of the big unctual manuscripts, and this is considered the Alexandrian family. Alexandria was a place where they had the ancient Library of Congress. Alexandria is where they collected books from all over the world. They had some of the best books, incredibly ever. But Codex Alexandrinus comes from probably that Alexandrian collection. There's a Caesarean family, and there's a Western family. And now I'm going down. The Alexandrian family is given priority because we've been able to check it out, and it seems to be the most accurate. We've been able to check it out with various things. You get all these other manuscripts, and you check out which one's the most accurate. Alexandrian seems to be best. Caesarean, a little bit worse. Western, a little bit down. The Byzantine texts come from the time of the Byzantines, okay? So it's going to be later, much later than these. The Byzantine texts are many, 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 okay? During the time if you get later, as you get more into the, 600s, 700s, up to 1000 AD, the scribes are copying more and more manuscripts. Christians are no longer being persecuted. You've got the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Church producing many, many more manuscripts. So the Byzantine manuscripts are often called the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus, some people abbreviate this, the TR stuff. The Textus Receptus, or the majority text. The majority text, some people call it the majority, just because there's so many of these minuscules. These are texts that are usually minuscules, and there are hundreds or thousands of these minuscule texts. As we said, there's 2,000 or 3,000 of these minuscule texts. So it's called the majority text just because there are many more of these texts. But notice, while there's many more, they're much later. So they're later than the other ones. The other ones are earlier, much earlier. We're talking 300, 400, 500 years earlier. Okay, so these are the majority that they have the most. The Textus Receptus is what the King James Version is based on. The King James Version was done in 1611. King James sponsored it. And they had, 40, 50, 60 translators, and he hired them, basically, and they did the translation, the King James translation. It's an incredible translation. It was very well done. It was done at about 1611. 1611. Think about William Bradford coming over to Boston in the Mayflower, and the Thanksgiving and stuff, the Mayflower coming over at 1620. So that's 9 years after this. They're just people are coming, pilgrims are coming to America. So anyways, this is the majority text, basically, is the background for the King James Version. Now, by the way, did the King James translators know about Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, or Alexandrinus? And the answer is no. They had no clue. Sinaiticus was only found in 1865. So it was like 200-300 years later that these unctual manuscripts came in, that people knew about them. So I don't fault the King James translators. They did the best with what they had. They had a lot of minuscules, so they used the minuscules. We know today that the minuscules are latest. They came, 1000 AD and things, so they're much later. We've got much earlier and much better documents now today. And we were able to coordinate thousands of them. The King James translators did not have computers and other things that they can coordinate things with. We have all that now. And so here's some rules for evaluating manuscripts. And these are rules that a person like Bruce Metzger at Princeton will use to evaluate. You got two manuscripts and they have different readings. One says, one thing, and another says another one. How do you evaluate it? Well, one way you do is you say the earlier the manuscript, the better. Now, that's not necessarily always the case, but most of the time, I'd rather have a document that's written in 200 AD rather than one that's written in 1200 AD. Because if it's written in 1200 AD, it's been copied and copied and copied over. Every time it gets copied, you're going to have more likelihood of making mistakes. Where something's earlier, 200, it may have been copied once or twice, and it doesn't have that much propensity to error. So the earlier is the better. Not always necessarily the truth, but that's a general rule. The wider geographical spread. Let me just give an example of this. let's suppose you've got 1,000 manuscripts in Boston. You've got 1,000 manuscripts in Boston. And let me say, and they read the text one way. For God so loved the world. Okay? And there's 1,000 of the manuscripts that have it, for God so loved the world. What happens if you have 5 manuscripts that are from New York, 5 manuscripts that are from, let's say, Philadelphia, 5 manuscripts that are in Miami, 5 manuscripts from LA, and 5 manuscripts from Seattle, and 5 manuscripts from Dallas, and all those 30 manuscripts from those 6 or 7 different places, they all say, then God loved the world and gave His only begotten Son, okay? They say then instead of for, okay? Which would you take? Would you take the 1,000 manuscripts in Boston, or would you take the other ones? Well, see, if they're spread out and they all agree from LA to Seattle to Dallas to Philadelphia and Miami, all those are spread out, the likelihood of those being corrupted is very small. Whereas if 1,000 manuscripts are in Boston, yeah, Boston may have more manuscripts, but the problem is they probably copied off each other, and so therefore that error is just reproduced 1,000 times. So the greater the geographical spread, the more likely it is to be correct. The greater the geographical spread, the more likely. Not always, that's not always the case, but generally. That's a good principle. Another is the family type. You check out the family. The Alexandrian family, as far as they've been able to check, is much more accurate than the Byzantine family. The Byzantine family is the majority text, mostly minuscules. It's late, and the Alexandrian is very early, unctual text, and more likely to be correct. And so you judge on the basis of family and family heritage. Now,